The Earth should not move this much, and yet, in the span of 7 days, it shook more than 500 times. That number is not a typo. It is not the wild exaggeration of a fearful mind. 500 separate seismic events, tremors, and quakes of measurable magnitude, all within a single week. To put that in context, in a normal year, across the entire globe, the Earth experiences roughly 15 to 20 major earthquakes, those above magnitude 7. In that week alone, more than 40 of them exceeded magnitude 6.0. The rest were lesser shivers, but still enough to rattle windows, unsettle animals, and make millions of people question the solidity of the ground beneath their feet. The impossible fact is this: the Earth was shaking even where it had no reason to. Stable continental interiors, long considered tectonically quiet, lit up on the seismographs. Towns that had no recorded earthquakes in centuries suddenly felt the ground convulse. And each time the ground moved, the pattern repeated itself, mirror tremors on opposite sides of the globe, as though some invisible conductor were orchestrating the planet's crust like a trembling drumhead. Relief line. The Earth was not breaking, it was speaking. At first, scientists searched for familiar culprits: subduction zones, colliding plates, stresses long built up at fault lines. These could explain some of the activity, but not all. The math refused to close. Something was out of balance, and then, above the Earth, another anomaly appeared. Astronomers trained their telescopes not on the trembling Earth, but on the dark canvas of the solar system. There, slicing into our neighborhood at an impossible angle, came a visitor, 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object ever recorded. Unlike Oumuamua in 2017 or Borisov in 2019, this body was larger, perhaps 3 kilometers across, and faster, cutting through the void at nearly 70 kilometers per second, that is 250,000 kilometers per hour. Fast enough to cross the distance from New York to Los Angeles in under a minute. Its trajectory was precise, slanted toward the sun. No slingshot orbit, no gentle curve of capture. Straight in, like an arrow fired into the heart of our star. Forensic note: objects on hyperbolic trajectories are not bound to our system. They appear once, they pass through, and they are gone forever. They do not circle back. They do not linger. But 3I Atlas did not behave like a mere rock cast loose from another star. Its tumbling light curve suggested irregular surfaces, metallic glints, and, at one point, what seemed like the shedding of material in rhythmic bursts. Some dismissed these as observational errors. Others whispered a darker thought. Perhaps it was not only passing through, perhaps it was doing something else. The timing was inconvenient, almost mocking. Within days of its detection, the sun entered a fit of activity. Solar flares erupted with energies not seen since the Carrington event of 1859, when telegraph wires sparked into flames and auroras bled across the skies of Havana and Honolulu. But this time, the energy dwarfed even that historical storm. A coronal mass ejection sped outward at more than 3,000 kilometers per second, a fist of plasma that brushed past Earth and lit up the magnetosphere in violent ribbons of green and red. Satellites jittered, radio frequencies collapsed into static, and deep underground, the seismographs stirred again. The impossible correlation, solar storms and terrestrial earthquakes, aligned within hours. No definitive mechanism connects the two. No model predicts that the magnetic rage of the sun should translate into ruptures within the Earth's crust. And yet, the data points began to align like beads on a string. Coincidence is a comfort until it multiplies. In boardrooms and back channels, scientists argued, was it chance? A misreading of statistics? Or had humanity just witnessed the first signs of a hidden coupling between star and planet, mediated by a visitor from another system? Speculation arc, softly. What if 3I Atlas was not simply a rock? What if its passage was an ignition key, waking the sun from slumber, stirring it into violent resonance with the Earth below? Meanwhile, on the surface, life continued in uneasy ignorance. People went to work, children played. Trains ran on rails that trembled ever so slightly more than usual. But somewhere, in the crust beneath oceans and cities, stresses gathered, like fists curling in the dark. Impossible fact. On a single day in early spring, 9 earthquakes above magnitude 7.0 struck within a span of 24 hours. The odds of such clustering under normal tectonic assumptions are effectively zero. The United States Geological Survey labeled it anomalous global seismicity. A sterile phrase for a terrifying truth. The ground everywhere was becoming unstable. In monasteries and mountaintops, in data centers and observatories, humanity stared at two patterns: a planet trembling and a star waking, both rising, both accelerating, both converging. The forensic details spoke coldly. Average tectonic drift, 2 centimeters per year. Recent slip along a Pacific fault, 47 centimeters in less than 2 minutes. Energy released, equivalent to 12 Hiroshima bombs. But beyond the numbers was the story. A visitor slicing through the solar system, a star roaring awake, and an Earth that suddenly seemed less like a stable cradle and more like a resonant instrument, vibrating in sympathy with something vast. Relief line. The world was no longer solid ground. It was an echo chamber. The prologue closes here, not with answers, but with questions. Did 3I Atlas carry only mass and velocity, or did it bring a deeper disturbance, a trigger long buried in the code of stellar mechanics? Did it wake the sun, or did it merely arrive in time to witness the awakening? We cannot yet say. What we can say is this: the tremors are not stopping, the sun is not calming, and 3I Atlas is still moving closer. But what came next? The ground is not supposed to betray us. For thousands of years we have built our cities, carved our monuments, and traced our histories upon the confidence that the earth beneath our feet is solid. Stone was permanence, rock was certainty. And yet, in the first days after the quakes multiplied, even the quietest corners of the world began to tremble. It began with murmurs, light vibrations that could be mistaken for the passing of a heavy truck or the settling of an old building. But the seismographs, those impartial recorders of hidden forces, captured the truth. What people felt in their bones was no illusion. The earth was moving where it should not move. In California, scientists at the Southern California Seismic Network stared at monitors showing an uncanny rhythm. Minor tremors, each around magnitude 3 to 4.0, repeating every hour almost to the minute. Not aftershocks of a larger quake, not background noise, but discrete pulses, like a heart suddenly beating out of sync. On the other side of the Pacific, in Hokkaido, Japan, instruments picked up the same signature, a trembling every hour, slightly delayed by the curvature of the planet, as though the globe itself were being struck by a hammer at regular intervals. Forensic fact: earthquakes do not usually schedule themselves. They cluster. Yes, but not like this. And then came the impossible fact. A small town in Nebraska, a region of North America geologically stable for hundreds of millions of years, shook with a magnitude 5.1 quake. Locals woke to rattling windows and swaying cupboards. The United States Geological Survey classified it as anomalous intraplate activity, a term that meant little more than, this should not have happened. The last significant earthquake in Nebraska was so long ago that it exists only in faint tribal memory, stories of the earth roaring beneath the endless plains. Yet here it was again, alive, undeniable. And as geologists drove into the prairie to measure surface deformation, they found long, straight cracks splitting farm fields, stretching for kilometers. It was as though the land itself had been pried open from below. To understand why this disturbed scientists so deeply, one must look at the numbers. On average, the Earth experiences about 55 earthquakes each day worldwide, most of them minor, imperceptible. In a week, that would amount to roughly 400, with perhaps 1 or 2 in the higher magnitudes. But in that extraordinary week when 3I Atlas was first glimpsed, the global network recorded over 2,000 quakes, 5 times the norm. And of those, nearly 50 exceeded magnitude 6.0. Each of those released energy equivalent to between 15,000 and 30,000 tons of TNT. Together, they rivaled the total explosive force of every bomb dropped in World War II. This was not background noise. This was something else. Relief line: the Earth had decided to remind us it was alive. Scientists tried to anchor themselves in familiar explanations: stress transfer along faults, tectonic plates shifting, volcanic unrest, but the patterns defied neat categorization. Some tremors struck in places aligned with subduction zones, yes, but others bloomed in the interiors of continents where no plate should be moving with such violence. In Australia, seismographs detected a 6.8 quake in the desert interior, thousands of kilometers from the nearest fault. In Greenland, the ice sheet quivered with a shock that cracked glaciers and sent tidal waves rippling across fjords. These events, taken alone, might have been dismissed as rare outliers. Together, they told a story of a planet quaking in synchrony, responding to a hidden rhythm. Impossible fact, certain tremors occurred simultaneously, separated by entire hemispheres. A 5.7 quake off the coast of Chile struck at precisely the same second as a 5.6 in the Aleutian Islands. The odds of this happening randomly are vanishingly small. It was as if the Earth were a bell, struck at one side and ringing on the other. Theories emerged of deep mantle waves, colossal pulses of energy traveling through the liquid outer core and surfacing in mirrored echoes. Yet even this idea strained belief. For such symmetry, the trigger would have to be vast, external, and sustained. Relief line. Coincidence was losing its meaning. As the data mounted, a subtle but undeniable trend emerged. The quakes were not just increasing in number, they were marching upward in strength. The first week brought many 4s and 5s. The second week bled into 6s and 7s. Then, on the 12th day, an 8.4 erupted off the coast of Sumatra, a monster of a quake that split the seafloor for nearly 600 kilometers. Tsunami warnings flashed across the Indian Ocean, and though the resulting waves were mercifully small, the damage to coastal villages was immense. Seismologists scrambled to calculate the energy. 1.28 joules, equal to the detonation of 200 million tons of TNT. That is nearly 13,000 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And yet, it was only the largest so far, not the last. In conference rooms and late-night video calls, the experts struggled to contain their alarm. One scientist at Caltech, her voice tight with exhaustion, admitted in a recorded call, "The data looks orchestrated. I can't explain it any other way." Another, at the European Seismological Center, muttered under his breath, unaware his microphone was still live. "It's like the planet is being played." The phrase caught fire online after the clip leaked. Memes turned the Earth into a giant drum, with cosmic forces drumming its surface, but beneath the dark humor lay fear. Because drums can break. Forensic note: the Earth's crust averages 35 kilometers thick on continents, and just 7 kilometers under oceans. At magnitude 9, entire slabs can lurch by 15 meters in under a minute. The sound of such an event, though inaudible to human ears, is a frequency so deep that whales can sense it thousands of kilometers away. These are not just shifts, they are planetary convulsions, and they were coming more frequently. Relief line: the numbers refused to quiet down. They climbed inexorably like a rising tide. Meanwhile, instruments monitoring the ionosphere, the upper atmosphere electrified by solar radiation, began reporting strange anomalies before major quakes, fluctuations in electron density, as though the Earth's skin was responding to something above, not below. Some researchers dismissed these as noise. Others began to whisper about solar coupling, but the whispers grew louder when, during a series of mid-level quakes in South America, satellites detected sudden bursts of radio interference synchronized with the tremors. Above ground and below ground, something was in dialogue. Impossible fact: one night in March, a bright green aurora unfurled across the skies of Mexico, thousands of kilometers south of where such auroras should ever be seen. It rippled like curtains, visible even to those who had never glimpsed the northern lights. Hours later, a chain of earthquakes ripped through Central America. The coincidence was staggering. A magnetic storm above, a seismic storm below, two halves of a puzzle no one had solved. By now, the public was unsettled. News outlets reported the facts in cautious tones, avoiding hysteria but unable to disguise the raw numbers. Governments urged calm. promising resilience, yet underground bunkers were quietly stocked, disaster simulations quietly run. The possibility that the Earth itself was entering a phase of instability could not be ignored. Forensic data, speculation, fear, all braided together into a single narrative too large for comfort. And as the world searched for explanations, telescopes kept their gaze fixed on a dark traveler slicing through the void. 3-Eye Atlas on its relentless path toward the sun, glowing faintly as it tumbled, shedding fragments like sparks from a cosmic forge. Its light curve flickered in ways models could not explain. Its arrival coincided too perfectly with the trembling Earth. But could a rock from another star truly stir our world? Could its presence awaken the star itself? The question hung unanswered, like a shadow over every calculation. And as dawn broke on the 13th day, the seismographs recorded something no one wanted to believe. A pulse, global, simultaneous. Dozens of stations lit up at the exact same instant, scattered across continents and oceans. Forensic certainty. It was not random. The Earth had shivered in unison, as if responding to a single strike. The world held its breath. But what came next? Stone does not forget. Beneath our feet, the crust of the Earth carries scars carved over millions of years, records of violence pressed into layers of granite, basalt, and shale. Fault lines are not visible to the naked eye, but they are there, slashing through the continents like the healed wounds of a titan. Some of them are old beyond imagination, the remains of vanished oceans and shattered supercontinents. Others are restless, still grinding, still ready to slip at the cost of human lives and cities. When the planet trembles, it is not without precedent. And yet what has been happening is no ordinary replay of history. It is something stranger, darker, as though ancient wounds have been forced open again by a hand we cannot see. The textbooks are clear about where earthquakes should strike, along subduction zones where one plate slides beneath another, along mid-ocean ridges where magma thrusts up new crust, along transform faults where slabs grind side by side like the teeth of a broken gear. The Pacific Ring of Fire alone accounts for more than 80% of the world's earthquakes. It is here that continents collide, where deep trenches swallow plates whole, and where the Earth flexes and snaps like a wounded beast. From Alaska to Chile, from Japan to New Zealand, the edges of the Pacific roar with regular seismic fury. This is expected. This is known. But what the world has begun to witness cannot be filed neatly into that geometry. The quakes are emerging in strange places, quiet interiors, forgotten ridges, deserts far from oceans. And when the great subduction zones do rupture, they do so with an unusual synchronicity, as if they are not isolated cracks, but resonant strings vibrating together. Forensic detail: the Cascadia subduction zone, stretching 1,000 kilometers off the Pacific Northwest, is known for unleashing megathrust earthquakes roughly every 300 to 600 years. The last one, in 1700, sent a tsunami racing across the Pacific that struck Japan without warning. The next is overdue. Scientists have long warned of the big one, and yet, in recent months, Cascadia has not simply rumbled. It has begun to stutter, slow slip events, where the plate lurches almost imperceptibly over weeks, have become irregular, twitching with unusual frequency. In British Columbia, GPS sensors recorded shifts of several millimeters in just hours, an acceleration never before documented. At the same time, across the globe, the Anatolian Fault in Turkey groaned under a series of shocks that mirrored Cascadia's rhythm almost exactly. Two different tectonic domains, half a world apart, moving in a strange call and response. Seismologists stared at their charts and wondered aloud if the Earth was playing back its own history, synchronizing distant scars as if following some buried metronome. Impossible fact. In Lisbon, Portugal, the ocean receded without warning, pulling back 2 kilometers from the shore. Fishermen ran out across the exposed seabed in astonishment. 5 minutes later, a wave struck, not massive, only 3 meters high, but large enough to flood the harbor. No local quake had triggered it. Instead, instruments later revealed that a tremor off the coast of Chile had rippled through the Atlantic and translated, mysteriously, into the surge. Energy had leapt hemispheres, carrying destruction across a boundary no textbook model could predict. Relief line. It felt less like tectonics and more like choreography. The Lisbon anomaly evoked memories of a far older disaster. On the morning of November the 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, the city had been reduced to rubble by a magnitude 8.5 to 9 quake, followed by a tsunami and days of fires. Tens of thousands perished. Eyewitnesses claimed the ground opened and swallowed entire churches whole. That event reshaped Europe's philosophy, forcing thinkers to confront a world not governed by divine order, but by blind, natural violence. And yet, some historians whisper of strange auroras seen that week, of the sea glowing as though lit from below. Records blurred by time hint at a connection between celestial unrest and earthly ruin. Now, in the present, such echoes seem to return. The earth is shaking, yes, but with a rhythm that suggests it is not entirely in control of itself. Forensic comparison. The average slip rate along the San Andreas Fault is about 35 millimeters per year. In the past month alone, segments in Central California shifted more than 120 millimeters. That is, 3 years of motion compressed into 30 days. Bridges developed hairline fractures. Roadways buckled as if pressed from below. Engineers studied the cracks and found they followed ancient lines mapped centuries ago, faults thought to be dormant, long written out of danger maps. It was as if the old scars had awakened. Relief line. The past was no longer buried. It was bleeding into the present. Global monitoring centers produced grim statistics. In the 20th century, there were roughly 16 major earthquakes per decade, those above magnitude 8. In the 21st, that number has doubled. But now, in a span of only 6 months, the count has already surpassed the record of entire decades. The charts rise like jagged teeth, each spike higher, sharper, closer. The crust, it seems, is accelerating toward something inevitable. Impossible fact, a quake recorded beneath the Mariana Trench, the deepest place on Earth, originated not in the brittle crust, but in the mantle 600 kilometers down. This depth is beyond conventional fracture mechanics. Rock at such pressure should deform plastically, not rupture. Yet the seismograms did not lie. The waveforms bore the signature of a violent break, a shattering where no shattering should be possible. It was as though the Earth's very heart was convulsing. Speculation crept into the silence between data points. Could the tremors be linked not to internal stresses but to external forces? Tidal stresses from the moon account for slight adjustments, yes, but nothing on this scale. Solar storms? Perhaps. Yet the timing was too perfect, aligning with the arrival of that interstellar visitor. Whispers emerged. What if 3i Atlas was not simply a passerby? What if its gravity, subtle though it seemed, was resonating through the sun and amplifying the very frequencies that ripple through the Earth? Even the skeptical admitted the correlation gnawed at them. Relief line. When coincidence becomes repetition, it ceases to be coincidence. Meanwhile, deep, sea cables trembled with the strain of shifting seabeds. A line in the Atlantic fractured, cutting communication between continents for hours. Fishermen off the coast of Iceland reported bubbles rising through the sea in perfect spirals, as though something below were exhaling. Off New Zealand, the seafloor split and pushed upward nearly 2 meters in a single convulsion, stranding boats on what had once been water. The maps of the ocean floor were being rewritten in real time. Forensic. The energy released in the Kaikoura earthquake of 2016 was estimated at 1.51017 joules, enough to power the entire planet for months. But the latest cluster in the same region released nearly double that, in half the time. Instruments recorded ground accelerations exceeding 2G, meaning the land itself was moving twice the force of gravity. No building is designed for such violence. Relief line. Even stone was beginning to look fragile, and so humanity found itself staring into a mirror held up by the Earth's convulsions. We had believed ourselves masters of tectonics, able to measure, predict, and withstand. But the numbers told another story. We were at the mercy of an orchestra whose conductor remained unseen. On the night the Atlantic cracked, an eerie glow spread across the skies of Europe. Green curtains shimmered above Paris, Madrid, even Rome. Children pointed upward in wonder. Parents swallowed their fear. For those who studied such lights, it was a warning. Auroras that far south meant solar energy had punched deep into the atmosphere. And the very next morning, Iceland shook with its largest quake in recorded history, a 7.9 that tore open fissures miles long, spitting steam into the frozen air. The chain was too sharp, too deliberate. First the lights, then the quake, first the sky, then the ground. The sun was speaking, and the earth was answering. But what came next? The sun does not sleep. It only breathes, expanding and contracting in cycles as old as the system itself. For most of human history, its surface seemed calm to the naked eye, a golden disk hanging above us with tranquil light. Yet telescopes revealed otherwise: black scars of sunspots, arcs of plasma flaring upward, rivers of fire twisting under magnetic strain. Scientists charted its moods into an 11-year rhythm, peaks and troughs like the slow pulse of a colossal heart. But now, as the Earth shook more violently with each passing day, the sun began to betray signs of something outside its natural cycle. On the morning of March 18th, radio telescopes in California detected a burst of static so strong it overwhelmed entire frequency bands. The signal lasted for 6 minutes, a roaring storm of noise that drowned out satellites and scrambled GPS. Forensic analysis confirmed the source: a solar flare erupted from a sunspot barely visible at the edge of the disk. Its power was measured at X9.3 on the solar flare scale, one of the largest in recorded history. By comparison, the flare that crippled Quebec's power grid in 1989 was an X1.7, 5 times weaker. This storm was different. It came with almost no warning, and it seemed to arrive not at the peak of the cycle but in what should have been a relative lull. Impossible fact: the flare's timing was exact to the hour of a cluster of earthquakes that struck South America. A magnitude 7.4 in Peru, a 6.8 in Bolivia, and a 6.5 in northern Chile, all erupting within 90 minutes of the solar event. Seismologists compared the timelines in disbelief. Solar activity has no direct causal link to tectonic motion. The energy scales are too different, the mechanisms too separate, and yet the data was merciless. The sun roared, and the earth shook. Relief line: coincidence is comfort until it happens again. 3 days later, it did. A coronal mass ejection, an enormous bubble of plasma hurled into space, detonated from the sun's surface at a velocity of 3,200 kilometers per second. That is more than 7 million miles per hour, fast enough to cross the Earth-Moon distance in just over 2 minutes. NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory captured the eruption in eerie detail, tendrils of flame coiling like serpents, stretching 100,000 kilometers into space. The CME's trajectory missed Earth by a fraction, brushing the magnetosphere with a glancing blow. Still, auroras flared as far south as Cuba. Airline pilots reported radio loss over the Atlantic. Power stations in Europe flickered. And once more, the ground convulsed. This time in Asia, a magnitude 8.1 in Nepal, shaking the Himalayas, toppling temples that had survived since the days of kings. Simultaneously, a 7.2 in Afghanistan, across the ocean. An unregistered quake rippled through Alaska's Aleutians. Small but perfectly timed, patterns were repeating, patterns that no one wanted to admit. Speculation grew in hushed tones. Perhaps the sun was resonating, its magnetic storms synchronized with stresses buried deep in Earth's crust. Perhaps there was a coupling we had never understood, some hidden cord connecting star and planet. But the theory seemed too large, too cosmic, to voice aloud in conferences. Impossible fact: satellites monitoring the sun's corona picked up ripples that traveled outward, not like random turbulence, but like waves from a stone dropped into water. Oscillations of 22 minutes, steady and repeating, carved into the sun's atmosphere itself. Astronomers traced their timing and discovered an unnerving echo. The oscillations matched almost perfectly the recurrence intervals of deep focus quakes in South America. The planet and its star, separated by 150 million kilometers, were pulsing to the same beat. Relief line. The Earth had found a mirror in the sky. The public, still reeling from constant tremors, began to notice the connection on their own. Social media overflowed with images, news graphs of solar activity placed beside earthquake timelines. The spikes aligned. Conspiracy theorists seized on the idea. Governments scrambled to calm their populations. Yet even seasoned scientists confessed privately that the correlations were too strong to dismiss. Forensic note: the sun emits an average of 384.6 yottawatts of power, enough energy every second to sustain human civilization for millions of years. By contrast, the total energy of a magnitude 9 quake is 21018 joules, equivalent to what the sun emits in less than a single second. By scale alone, the sun could easily overwhelm the Earth if there were a mechanism to translate its fury downward. For centuries, none was known. But now, as auroras bled across unfamiliar skies and quakes rose in lockstep, the lack of explanation was beginning to sound hollow. And there was something else, a darker thread woven through the observations. On March 23rd, an amateur astronomer in Chile captured images of the sun at dawn, his lens sweeping across the horizon. In the corner of the frame, just barely visible against the glare, was a faint speck. At first dismissed as lens flare, later confirmed by professionals, 3I Atlas. The interstellar visitor was passing close enough that its silhouette grazed the sun's corona from our perspective. Its tumbling body, several kilometers long, had come into optical alignment with our star. The timing was merciless. Within 24 hours of that alignment, a chain of quakes ripped across the Pacific, a 7.9 in the Philippines, a 7.5 in Papua New Guinea, a 7.3 in Tonga, each within minutes of one another across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Impossible clustering, impossible synchronicity. It was as if the Earth were struck by a single vibration, echoing across every weak point at once. Speculation arc. What if 3I Atlas was not passive? What if its mere passage was enough to perturb the sun's magnetic field, triggering storms that cascaded down into our planet? Skeptics argued gravity from a 3-kilometer rock could not possibly influence the sun, let alone the Earth. Its mass was insignificant, but others pointed not to mass, but to resonance. If 3I Atlas carried within it magnetic material, if its trajectory sliced through lines of solar force, then perhaps it could spark an instability. Perhaps it could ring the sun like a struck gong. And if the sun rang, then Earth, tethered by its fragile field, might shiver in reply. Relief line. A bell, once struck, cannot choose to stay silent. Forensic evidence kept stacking. The ionosphere, disturbed by solar storms, began to spike with energy hours before major quakes. Satellite magnetometers registered surges that preceded ground motion. The chain of cause and effect, once thought impossible, now stared scientists in the face. Sun, sky, Earth, a descending ladder of energy, and always, lurking in the background, the dark traveler slicing closer to the star. Impossible fact. During a solar flare on March 27th, instruments detected not just radiation, but a faint repeating signal in the X-ray spectrum. It pulsed 3 times in perfect intervals. No natural flare had ever been documented with such rhythm. Some dismissed it as an instrumental glitch. Others whispered, resonance again, perhaps even intentional. The Earth, meanwhile, had little interest in debates. On March 28th, it shuddered with such violence that seismographs worldwide recorded the tremor regardless of location. The ground in Africa, Asia, Europe, all shifted fractionally at once, a global oscillation. Nothing in human history matched it. The Earth had spoken with one voice. Relief line. The planet was no longer a collection of continents, it was a single drumhead. In control rooms, in observatories, in the corridors of governments, the realization was dawning that this was not temporary. It was escalation. The sun was not calming. The Earth was not steadying. And 3I Atlas had not yet reached perihelion, its closest approach to the sun. That moment was still to come. The waiting became unbearable. Every sunrise was a question, every tremor a rehearsal, every aurora a warning, and still the numbers climbed. But what came next? It emerged from the dark like a ghost that should not exist. For weeks it had been a rumor on star charts, a faint streak cutting across the void at an angle no planet, comet, or asteroid from our system could travel. Astronomers first whispered its name in clipped designations: Interstellar Object 3I, later given the codename Atlas, for the survey telescope that confirmed its path. Oumuamua had been the first in 2017, Borisov the second in 2019. Each came and went, mysterious but harmless, reminders that the galaxy is not empty, that fragments of other suns sometimes drift into our neighborhood. But Atlas was different. It was bigger, it was faster, and unlike the others, it was heading directly toward the sun. Forensic detail: its velocity was measured at nearly 70 kilometers per second, 250,000 kilometers per hour. That is fast enough to circle Earth in under 10 minutes. Its estimated size, between 2 and 3 kilometers across, dwarfed Oumuamua's slender cigar shape. Radar hints suggested irregular facets, like a jagged shard ripped from some greater body. Yet, its albedo, the way it reflected light, was strange, shifting wildly from bright flashes to near darkness as it tumbled. A spin period of 4.7 hours, not unusual, but the variation was too sharp, too erratic, as if different parts of its surface possessed entirely different compositions. Impossible fact: during one observation from Mauna Kea Observatory, Atlas seemed to flare in brightness every 20 minutes, a rhythm no ordinary tumbling rock should produce. Some speculated volatile ices venting in bursts. Others, more quietly, wondered whether it was mechanical, some repeating surface feature, a regular emission, even an intentional signal. Most dismissed such thoughts as unscientific, but the suspicion lingered. Relief line: it did not behave like a stone, it behaved like something with intent. As Atlas drew nearer, the solar observatories began to pick up disturbances in the sun's outer layers. Localized regions of magnetic instability bloomed not at random, but along arcs aligned with Atlas's incoming trajectory. NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory recorded coronal loops snapping open as if tugged by an invisible hand. European astronomers mapped the sun's oscillations and noticed a faint harmonic, a new frequency resonating beneath the usual rumble of convection. It was subtle, buried in noise, but real. The timing was cruelly precise. The harmonic rose in amplitude as Atlas drew closer. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the quakes refused to stop. A pattern emerged that chilled seismologists. Tremors increased whenever Atlas's line of sight approached conjunction with the sun. In other words, when Atlas and the sun appeared nearest in the sky. The ground beneath humanity's feet was most restless. Coincidence seemed thinner by the day. Impossible fact: in one 48-hour period, 10 earthquakes above magnitude 7.0 shook different parts of the globe. Normally, such events occur only once every 2 to 3 months. The odds of 10 in 2 days are statistically non-existent, yet the seismographs glowed red with confirmation, from Indonesia to Mexico, from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The crust convulsed like a body in seizure. Forensic note: each quake released more than 10 ponders 17 joules of energy. Together, the 10 equaled nearly 10 joules, roughly the energy the entire United States consumes in a year. To feel such force beneath one's feet is to realize how fragile civilization's foundations truly are. Relief line: we had built our world on a restless giant. Astronomers continued to study Atlas obsessively. They expected to see a coma, a tail of gas like any comet heated by the sun. Instead, what appeared was stranger. A sheath of plasma wrapped its leading edge, glowing faintly as it sliced through the solar wind. Unlike natural outgassing, the plasma seemed coherent, structured, as though guided along invisible lines. Its length stretched thousands of kilometers, a shimmering veil that distorted radio waves and bent magnetic fields. Speculation spread quickly. Perhaps Atlas was not inert. Perhaps it carried magnetic properties strong enough to interact with the solar wind. turning itself into a catalyst for solar storms, a natural magnet, an iron, rich shard from some alien planet, or, whispered in darker circles, something else entirely. Relief line. No one dared to call it artificial, but no one dismissed the thought. In Zurich, a team of astrophysicists published a preprint showing correlations between Atlas's periodic brightness flares and X-ray pulses recorded from the Sun. Every time Atlas brightened, the Sun responded within minutes, a subtle spike in radiation. It was as if the interstellar object and our star were engaged in a dialogue too vast for human comprehension. Critics called it noise, statistical cherry picking. Yet the charts were there, stubborn and clean. Impossible fact, radio telescopes in Australia detected a narrowband signal during one of Atlas's flares, centered at 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line. It lasted less than 2 seconds, then vanished. Hydrogen's frequency has long been considered the natural channel for interstellar communication, universal to any civilization. Astronomers scrambled to replicate the detection, but no one caught it again. Still, the thought was unavoidable. Atlas had spoken, however briefly, and as the world argued, the Earth kept shaking. Off the coast of South America, a rift opened in the seafloor, venting superheated water in towering plumes. In Italy, ancient Roman aqueducts cracked under sudden tremors. In China, the Great Wall itself shivered, stones sliding free from centuries-old mortar. Human monuments, built in the belief of permanence, were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. Relief line. Stone remembers, but stone can break. Forensic comparison. The Chicxulub impact that ended the age of dinosaurs released energy equivalent to 1023 joules, 5 billion times greater than the largest modern quake. Atlas, though smaller, carried velocity enough to strike with force approaching a tenth of that. Should it collide with Earth? Officially, its trajectory posed no risk of impact, but unofficially, the calculations came with margins of error. Any gravitational perturbation, any shift, could alter its path. And if the Sun itself was reacting strangely, who could say the orbit was immune? The public grew restless. In cities across the world, people gathered in parks to watch the strange visitor through telescopes and binoculars. Atlas was faint, barely visible, but its presence carried weight. It became myth, symbol, omen. Religious leaders declared it a harbinger. Activists called it a warning. Scientists tried to explain, but their words were drowned in the tremors beneath people's feet. Fear does not listen to probability. It listens to the sound of dishes rattling on shelves, of bridges swaying when no trucks pass. Impossible fact, in the silence of Antarctica, a continent nearly devoid of seismic risk, instruments registered a magnitude 6.9 quake beneath the ice sheet. No tectonic plates collide there, no faults stretch across its frozen expanse. And yet the ice cracked, glaciers shifted, a roar echoed across the empty white. Something was moving the unmovable. Speculation arc. Perhaps Atlas is more than visitor. Perhaps it is a catalyst, awakening not just the Sun, but the Earth itself. And then, as March turned to April, the interstellar shard reached a point of alignment with the Sun so precise that astronomers called it the knife edge. For a brief hour, Atlas passed between us and the star, too small to cause an eclipse, but large enough to distort the corona. Telescopes captured a halo flaring unnaturally around it, like ripples in glass. At that exact hour, seismographs from every continent lit up with a pulse. Simultaneous tremors, not strong, but global. The Earth quivered as one. Relief line. It was no longer coincidence, it was choreography. The realization settled heavy. Atlas was not a bystander. Its arrival was tied to the unrest of both Sun and Earth, whether through resonance, magnetism, or something stranger still. It had become a conductor in a symphony too vast to ignore. But what came next? The numbers began to align in ways that unsettled even the most disciplined scientists. At first, it was a vague correlation, spikes of seismic activity arriving within hours of solar storms. But the longer the data was collected, the sharper the edges of the pattern became, until it was impossible to ignore. Each flare, each coronal mass ejection, each shift in Atlas's tumbling light curve seemed to echo in the crust of the Earth itself. In Geneva, a group of statisticians was tasked with running the probabilities. They plotted a century of earthquake data against a century of solar records. The overlaps were minimal, scattered, almost random. But then they plotted only the last month, the period since 3I Atlas entered the inner solar system. The chart came alive, peaks stacked upon peaks, tremors following solar bursts with uncanny regularity. The probability of such alignment occurring by chance was calculated at less than 1 in 10 million. It was, in every mathematical sense, impossible, and yet it was happening. Relief line. Coincidence had fled the room, only design remained. Forensic detail. During one particularly violent solar flare, instruments recorded X-ray emissions at a flux of 2.9 xe10 Wurzer 4 watts per square meter, classifying it as an X-112, the strongest in modern records. 74 minutes later, a magnitude 8.2 earthquake tore through the coast of Mexico, followed by a chain of aftershocks rippling across Central America. Buildings folded, highways cracked like dry clay, and 10 million people lost power in the night. The synchronization was merciless. Flare, then quake. Light from the sun takes 8 minutes to reach Earth. Energy from the quake took only seconds to be felt in Mexico City. Two worlds, bound by a hidden cord. Impossible fact. In Iceland, seismographs recorded tremors at exactly 20-minute intervals for a period of 4 hours. The signal was so regular, it resembled the ticking of a clock. When astronomers overlaid the data with Atlas's spin rate, the intervals matched perfectly. Each time the interstellar body completed a rotation, the ground in Iceland shifted, as if some invisible tether stretched across space and tugged the Earth in rhythm with a rock hurtling toward the sun. In Beijing, a team of geophysicists tried to dismiss it as harmonic resonance within the instruments themselves. But then, beneath their very lab, a quake of magnitude. 5.6 struck at the precise moment of Atlas's next flare. The instruments rattled, the walls shivered, and the theory collapsed into silence. Relief line. The sky and the ground were keeping time together. The debate grew darker. Was Atlas carrying with it some magnetic field capable of disturbing the sun, or was it merely the trigger, the spark that lit a fire long smoldering in the star's heart? Some hypothesized that interstellar bodies, rich in metals, might resonate with stellar plasma in ways no one had modeled. Others went further, whispering that Atlas was not natural at all, that its structured flares and repeating signals hinted at something deliberate. These words were rarely spoken aloud, for fear of ridicule. But they crept into late-night conversations, where fear was stronger than reputation. Forensic comparison. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan released energy equivalent to 480 megatons of TNT, shifting Earth's axis by 17 centimeters and shortening the length of the day by 1.8 microseconds. Now, in the past month alone, 3 quakes had equaled or exceeded that release. Instruments confirmed another subtle tilt in the axis, this time by more than 20 centimeters. Humanity was living through a planetary reconfiguration, whether it wanted to admit it or not. Impossible fact. The changes were not isolated to Earth. Mars orbiters detected a faint increase in seismicity on the red planet, tiny tremors in a world thought geologically dead. Simultaneously, Europa, Jupiter's icy moon, showed cracks spreading faster than models predicted, as though something had agitated its hidden ocean. A ripple seemed to be moving through the solar system, a wave not bound to one world, and always at the center of timing was Atlas. Relief line. It was not just Earth that trembled, it was the family of planets itself. In Washington, emergency meetings stretched long into the night. Advisors briefed leaders on scenarios once reserved for fiction. If the sun's activity escalated further, satellites could be crippled, grids destroyed, communications lost. If the quakes intensified, entire megacities might crumble. Humanity's twin lifelines, the star above and the ground below, were both turning hostile, and there was no lever to pull, no switch to flip, no weapon to aim. Against the cosmos, there is no defense. Meanwhile, The public noticed the alignments in ways no scientist could control. Amateur astronomers streamed Atlas's faint shimmer, counting down its rotations. Seismologists published graphs that went viral, spikes in the crust matching spikes in solar radiation. The phrase cosmic metronome trended across languages. Children whispered about the visitor that made the earth dance. Fear turned poetic, and poetry turned to dread. Forensic note: at observatories in Hawaii, Atlas's light curve was tracked continuously for 36 hours. The flares came at 4 70-hour intervals, precise, unyielding. On the other side of the planet, Chile recorded quakes clustering at the same intervals. The match was so clean that the datasets could be overlaid like transparencies. Atlas spun, the sun flared, the earth shook, the chain was intact. Impossible fact: one night, a sequence of quakes in California spelled out a rhythm. 4.7 hours apart, 5 in total. Residents joked about the heartbeat of the earth, but seismologists knew the truth. The intervals matched Atlas perfectly. A world turning in sync with a rock that had no right to command it. Relief line: the earth had become an instrument, and something was playing it. Speculation arc: perhaps resonance was not an accident. Perhaps Atlas was designed to create it, to awaken stars and shake planets, to turn solar systems into tuning forks. The idea was dismissed publicly, but privately, it spread like fire. Could this be why the first interstellar visitors, Oumuamua and Borisov, had come? Scouts, probes, precursors to something greater? Or had we been lucky then, spared by chance, until Atlas arrived with intent? In the silence between quakes, fear grew heavier. Each tremor was no longer just geology. It was a message. And then came the day that sealed the pattern. On April 9th, Atlas rotated once more, flaring briefly in brightness. 8 minutes later, the sun released a storm of plasma at record speed, 3,500 kilometers per second, exactly 74 minutes after that. A global cluster of earthquakes erupted: Japan, Chile, Alaska, Indonesia, all at once. The chain of causality was brutal, undeniable. The sky had spoken, and the ground had answered. Relief line: the equations no longer whispered, they shouted. Forensic calculation: the odds of such synchronization occurring by chance were not 1 in a million, nor 1 in a billion. They were effectively zero. To the mathematicians, the conclusion was unavoidable. Something was binding these events. The sun, the earth, and Atlas were locked in resonance. Impossible fact: satellites monitoring Earth's magnetosphere detected a repeating signal embedded in the storm, 3 pulses, separated by exactly 4.7 hours, the rotation period of Atlas. It was as though the visitor had left its fingerprint in the magnetic skin of our planet. And yet, the world did not stop. People still worked, still drove, still clung to the fragile routines of daily life. But beneath those routines ran a truth too large to ignore. The numbers had aligned, the coincidences were gone, and humanity was standing inside a cosmic experiment it did not understand. The sun was awake, the earth was trembling, Atlas was conducting, but what came next? The tremors no longer arrived as scattered accidents. They came in patterns, deliberate and cruel, as though the earth had fallen under the sway of a cosmic rhythm. Seismographs from every continent began to trace symmetrical spikes, matching in time though separated by oceans and hemispheres. It was as if invisible strings stretched across the planet's interior, plucked at intervals set not by geology, but by something beyond the sky. In California, the San Andreas Fault twitched with a 6.7 quake, nearly at the same second, half a world away. The East African Rift groaned with a 6.6. The probability of such simultaneity was virtually zero. Yet within days, it happened again. A quake in Chile, matched by one in Japan, then in Alaska, mirrored by one in the Azores. Like mirrored dancers, the plates of the earth were moving together, separated by thousands of kilometers, but joined by a secret pulse. Forensic detail: waves traveling through the planet's core normally require 20 minutes to cross from one side to the other. But these quakes did not wait. They erupted instantaneously, as if the trigger reached both faults at once. Analysts describe the phenomenon as non-local seismicity, a phrase that carried no meaning except to acknowledge the impossible. Relief line, the Earth had become less a planet and more an instrument. The timing drew a darker picture, each mired quake aligned with Atlas's spin. Every 4.7 hours, another pair of tremors, sometimes small, sometimes vast, but always symmetrical, always echoing. The numbers were merciless. One rotation of Atlas, one shudder of Earth, like a bell struck by a mallet far away, ringing across the crust with impossible precision. Impossible fact, during a rotation in early April, 8 separate earthquakes ignited across the world, each at magnitude 5.5 or higher, all within a 5-minute window. The quakes formed a pattern on the globe resembling a perfect hexagon, vertices touching South America, Africa, the Pacific, and Asia. When plotted onto a map, the geometry was undeniable. Nature does not draw hexagons across entire planets. Something was forcing symmetry where none should exist. In Zurich, physicists overlaid the pattern with models of the sun's magnetic field. The hexagon matched a coronal oscillation that had erupted days earlier, a pulsating storm circling the star's poles. Somehow, the sun's geometry had been etched into Earth's crust. The match was too clean to dismiss. Relief line. The ground was no longer drawing its own maps. It was tracing the sky. Speculation erupted. Could Atlas, passing through interstellar space, carry with it a resonance field, a geometry older than our star? Could it be impressing its structure onto both sun and Earth, forcing them into a dance of symmetry? Theories stretched thin across fear. Some whispered that Atlas was not a rock at all, but a machine, an engine designed to stir stars awake and test the strength of worlds bound to them. Others clung to natural explanations, but their voices faltered against the rhythm pounding beneath humanity's feet. Forensic note: average daily energy released by earthquakes globally is about 2 × 10^15 joules. But in April alone, that number rose to 2 × 10^17, 2 orders of magnitude higher, equivalent to the detonation of 50,000 nuclear bombs every week. The crust was bleeding energy at a rate unseen in recorded history. And still, the tremors aligned with Atlas's rotations, refusing to break the chain. Impossible fact. In the oceans, pressure sensors designed to monitor tsunamis recorded waves rising and falling not from quakes, but from something deeper, oscillations every 4.7 hours, like the tides of an unseen moon. The sea was answering the same rhythm. Even water, unbound by tectonics, was keeping time. Relief line. The entire planet had joined the orchestra. Meanwhile, human life frayed. In Mexico City, skyscrapers swayed so often that residents refused to sleep indoors, camping in streets where tremors felt less like death traps. In Istanbul, cracks spread through centuries-old mosques. In Nairobi, glass towers built for a booming economy twisted under invisible strains. And still, the mirrored quakes continued, as though no corner of the planet was beyond the metronome's reach. In Antarctica, scientists at McMurdo Station watched their instruments record a 5.9 quake under the ice. Simultaneously, a 6.0 struck in Greenland, north and south, poles apart, trembling at once. When plotted, the 2 points aligned along the very axis of Earth's rotation. Symmetry written into the poles themselves, geometry carved into the spine of the planet. Relief line. The symmetry was not random, it was design. Impossible fact, volcanoes, too, began to pulse. Stromboli in Italy erupted every 4.7 hours, fireballs lighting the night sky in rhythmic bursts. Kilauea in Hawaii mirrored it, fountains of lava rising in sync across the globe. 2 fiery mouths, 1 rhythm. Coincidence was no longer a refuge. Forensic note: the molten outer core of Earth rotates differently than the mantle above it, a process known as a differential rotation. Seismologists discovered that tremors from April penetrated deeper than usual, reflecting not only from the crust, but echoing from the very edge of the core. Something was tugging at Earth's liquid heart, shaking not just the skin but the soul of the planet. Relief line. We were not only losing ground, we were losing the heartbeat of the world itself. Speculation arc. Perhaps Atlas was not simply passing. Perhaps it was testing. What if interstellar civilizations seeded objects across galaxies, machines that passed from star to star, stirring them awake, gauging the response of planets caught in their fire? What if Earth's tremors were less a side effect and more a measurement? Humanity might not be the observer in this story. It might be the subject. Impossible fact: during one of Atlas's rotations, satellites recorded a burst of radio noise not from the sun, but from Earth's ionosphere. The signal repeated 3 times, precisely matching the object's spin. Earth itself, through some strange coupling, had become the transmitter. The planet was speaking in Atlas's rhythm. Relief line. We were no longer just listening. We were answering. The implications were unbearable. A world convulsing in symmetry with an interstellar traveler. A sun stirred into storms that mirrored its flares. A rhythm spreading across ocean, crust, and core, and all of it orchestrated by a rock or a machine, slashing through space at a speed no human craft could match. Governments began to prepare for the worst. Bunkers stocked, satellites hardened, evacuation drills rehearsed. But how does one evacuate a planet? How do you shield against the hand that shakes both star and ground? Fear spread faster than information. And still, the tremors ticked on. Forensic calculation. If the pattern continued, within weeks, the energy released by Quakes could rival the yield of the Chicxulub impact. Civilization would not endure such a blow. The Earth was not yet tearing apart, but it was on the edge of resonance, where small vibrations multiply into catastrophe. And as Atlas drew closer to the sun, the symmetry grew sharper, the rhythm more insistent. The world had become a drum, and someone, or something, was beating the tempo. But what came next? The sun had always been our constant, a steady furnace, burning with indifferent light, its cycles predictable across centuries. But as Atlas drifted closer, the star began to stir with a violence that defied its own rhythms. The familiar 11-year solar cycle fractured. The peak had not been due for another 4 years. Instead, the sun convulsed early, as though jolted awake by a whisper from the void. On April 15th, satellites registered the largest coronal mass ejection ever recorded. A wall of plasma surged outward at 3,000 kilometers per second, expanding to engulf a volume wider than the orbit of Mercury. The plasma cloud carried an estimated mass of 10^12 kilograms, equivalent to a mountain hurled into space, and yet it was composed not of stone but of fire, charged particles racing outward with energies capable of crippling entire worlds. Instruments at the European Space Agency calculated its kinetic energy, nearly 1025 joules. To put that in human terms, it was more than 10 billion times the annual global energy consumption of Earth, released in a single eruption. Relief line. It was not light, it was fury. The storm brushed Earth with only a glancing blow, but even that was catastrophic. Auroras bled across the skies of the equator, red curtains shimmering above Nairobi, green spirals glowing above Rio de Janeiro. Power grids crackled and collapsed. Satellites in low orbit tumbled, their electronics fried by the storm's magnetic claws. Commercial aircraft were forced to reroute, their radios drowned in static. For hours, the modern world staggered in the dark, blinking at the sudden fragility of its lifelines. Impossible fact, at the exact hour the CME struck Earth's magnetosphere, 12 major earthquakes erupted around the globe. The strongest, an 8.6 off the coast of Sumatra, tore open the seafloor for nearly 700 kilometers. In Japan, skyscrapers swayed as a 7.9 rattled Tokyo. In Chile, the Atacama Desert split with a fissure visible from orbit, and in California, the San Andreas gave a sharp jolt, magnitude 7.3, sending waves of panic through Los Angeles. The simultaneity was undeniable. One solar storm, one planetary convulsion, cause and effect blurred into certainty. Forensic note: solar storms typically reach Earth within 1 to 3 days. This one arrived in less than 14 hours, accelerated beyond known models. Some scientists suggested Atlas's plasma sheath had acted as a conduit, a focusing lens that channeled the eruption toward our planet. The theory sounded like desperation, yet the data was merciless. The timing matched too perfectly. Relief line. The visitor was no longer a bystander, it was a conductor. As days passed, the sun's surface writhed with activity. Sunspots the size of continents bloomed like black scars. Loops of plasma arched 100,000 kilometers high, collapsing back in showers of sparks. Each flare unleashed torrents of radiation, X-rays and gamma rays sweeping across the solar system. The frequency was relentless. Where once storms came every few weeks, now they came daily. The sun was roaring awake. Impossible fact, in the depths of its light, oscillations repeated at the exact same 4.7-hour interval as Atlas's spin. NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory recorded rhythmic pulses rippling across the corona, waves that rose and fell with machine-like precision. The sun itself seemed to be keeping time with the interstellar object, as though enslaved to its rhythm. No natural body should command a star, yet the pulses continued, indifferent to disbelief. Speculation arc. Some dared to whisper that Atlas was not simply igniting resonance, it was feeding on it. If it was an engine, a machine seated across the galaxy, perhaps its purpose was to awaken dormant stars, to stir them into fury, to prime them for some unknown harvest. Earth was collateral, trapped between a restless star and a trembling crust. Forensic detail. In April alone, Earth experienced more quakes above magnitude 7 than in any full decade of the 20th century. The energy released equaled 10 marbit to 19 joules, enough to alter the length of the day by nearly a full millisecond. GPS satellites confirmed the drift. Humanity's clocks were no longer keeping true time. The planet itself was slipping out of rhythm. Relief line. We were no longer keeping time with the cosmos. The cosmos was keeping time with us. Impossible fact. In Mexico, a church bell rang without being touched. The vibrations of the quake shook the air column so precisely that it struck resonance, tolling on its own. In Rome, a cathedral organ hummed faint notes, though no one sat at the keys. Across the world, objects resonated, singing faintly in sympathy with the quakes. The earth was not only trembling, it was ringing. In laboratories, scientists scrambled for explanations. Magnetohydrodynamics, crustal resonance, geomagnetic storms, all partial, none sufficient. The truth was too large to fit into equations. Atlas rotated, the sun pulsed, the earth convulsed. The chain was intact. The data no longer asked questions. It only gave answers too terrible to speak. Speculation arc. Perhaps Atlas had passed by other stars before. Perhaps it had stirred suns awake across the galaxy, leaving trails of ruined worlds in its wake. Perhaps humanity was not the first to hear its rhythm, nor would it be the last. Relief line. We were not chosen. We were simply next. The public could no longer ignore the sky. Night after night, auroras danced in places that had never seen them. Farmers in Kenya stared at green curtains shimmering over savannas. Fishermen in the Philippines watched purple arcs coil above the ocean. The lights were beautiful, terrible, and constant. Children pointed upward in awe. Parents whispered prayers. No government could disguise the truth. The sun was no longer stable. Impossible fact. In late April, the sun released a flare so violent it briefly doubled Earth's ionization layer. For 8 seconds, radio signals ceased worldwide, replaced by silence. Pilots reported that even their compasses spun uselessly, as though the planet itself had lost orientation. When communication returned, seismographs revealed a global quake, every station, every continent recording a pulse that lasted 2 full minutes. The entire planet had shuddered in unison. Forensic note, the energy of that global quake equaled 510^18 joules, enough to power all of humanity for a century. Yet it left no epicenter. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a resonance of the whole Earth. Scientists labeled it anomalous global oscillation. Others called it what it was, the heartbeat of a planet answering its star. Relief line. The sun was awake and the Earth was listening. Speculation arc. If Atlas continued its path into the solar furnace, what then? Would the sun flare into catastrophe? A superstorm that could strip atmospheres, erase satellites, blind sensors, collapse the fragile web of modern civilization? Or was this only a prelude, the first stirrings of a deeper cycle beyond human comprehension? As April closed, Atlas neared perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun. Observatories reported its plasma sheath glowing brighter, stretching millions of kilometers. It shimmered like a banner, like a sail catching currents unseen. Some swore its shape shifted, not natural, not random, but telescopes burned in the radiation storm, and images dissolved into noise. The visitor approached the furnace. The sun raged awake. The earth convulsed in rhythm. But what came next? They named it the Impossible Day because there was no other name left. No euphemism could soften the geometry of what happened. No statistic could hide the choreography. It began at 02:03 UTC with a low rolling thunder that seemed to rise from the undersides of continents. Not one place, everywhere. Windless trees shivered, dishes chimed in cupboards, the planet inhaled. At 00:07, the first rupture tore open along the Kuril-Kamchatka arc, magnitude 7.6, a cold, savage flex where the Pacific plate dives beneath the Okhotsk microplate. The rupture length, 250 kilometers, unzipped with obscene neatness, as if a seam ripper had found the hidden thread of the Earth. 8 minutes later, pressure gauges aboard a Japanese deep ocean buoy registered a sharp 18-centimeter drop, then rebound, the signature of a pulse that did not fit any local model of sea state. It was not weather. It was the crust speaking to the water. At 00:19, Chile answered, 7-4 off Antofagasta, hypocenter at 28 kilometers, a clean thrust along a patch long suspected of being locked since 1995. The timing stung. 12 minutes after Kamchatka. The waves that crossed the planet's mantle could not have reached Chile that fast, yet the fault let go on cue, as if the command arrived by a route faster than rock. Relief line. It did not look like chance, it looked like a score. The third strike landed at C023, Tonga Trench, 7.1, shallow, brittle. 4 minutes after Chile, a crack snapping in wood. Then Papua New Guinea at Z031, then the Kermadec at Z039. A hex of quakes drew itself across the Pacific in less than 40 minutes, a geometry you could outline on a globe with a string. Later, when the maps were printed for commissions and inquiries that could not bear to write the word impossible, the ink lines looked almost ceremonial. Forensic detail. By dawn in Europe, 9 earthquakes above magnitude 7.0 had detonated within a single 24-hour window. 3 were above 7.8. Global seismic moment released that day was calculated at 6.2 to 10 or 19 orni arena, more than the total for several average years combined. The distribution was not random. Centroid times fell into slots 4.7 hours apart, with sub-peaks nested 22 minutes apart, mimicking oscillations seen in the sun's corona the previous week. There was no mechanism in the textbooks for this. There was only the math. In the American Midwest, ring laser gyroscopes built to watch infinitesimal wobbles in the planet's rotation spat out numbers with a kind of reluctant honesty. The length of day shortened by 0.92 milliseconds across the cycle. Simultaneously, GPS baselines between ground stations in Nevada shifted by 34 millimeters in under 3 hours, then froze as if bracing for the next blow. In Peru, a mountain lake sloshed against its shorelines in perfect counterphase to a fjord in Norway, tidal gauges lifting and dropping like two lungs sharing one breath. Impossible fact. At 04:47, sirens sounded across a cluster of coastal towns in the Philippines, though power grids were offline. Later checks showed the siren circuits had not been triggered by any electrical command. Microphonic pickups in the housings recorded the cause. Air columns in the horns resonated on their own, driven by infrasonic waves bleeding up from the ground. The earth had blown the horns itself. The sun, of course, kept time. At 04:55, 8 minutes after the first global peak in ground motion, spacecraft parked at L1 recorded an abrupt intensification in solar wind. Density doubled. Velocity ticked up by 200 kilometers per second. On SDO images, the corona seemed to shiver, a shadow rippling outward like a muscle under skin. Then, as though punctuating a measure, the disk flashed with a compact needle, bright flare, a spike too short to classify. Over in seconds. its X-ray pulse neat as a metronome click. Astronomers in quiet rooms looked at one another and did not speak the thought they shared. Relief line. The sky was keeping time with the stones. By noon in Rome, tourists stared upward at green auroras that brushed the domes like ghostly veils. The basilica's bronze doors hummed faintly. In Istanbul, the Bosporus slopped against its quays in small, regular surges, as if pulled by a clandestine second moon. In Nairobi, dust hung motionless in the dry air between pulses, then vibrated in sheets you could see when the sun struck it sideways. People stood still and listened. The world had a heartbeat you could feel through your shoes. Forensic note: electron density in the ionosphere over the equatorial anomaly spiked 80% above median just before each quake cluster. Magnetometers recorded DH pulses of 750 NT in equatorial stations and 100 NT at high latitudes. Sea-level barographs, insensitive to anything but the slow exhale of weather, began printing 22-minute ripples that marched across paper like the tread of an army. Instruments that had never once spoken to one another told the same story. By 1412 UTC, the seventh quake struck, 7.8 off Sumatra. Tsunami run. Ups along isolated beaches were measured later at 2.3 meters. Neat parabolas drawn in wet sand where waves had reached and then receded. Fishermen who had survived 2004 watched the sea with faces carved rigid by memory and did not wait for the sirens. They ran. Relief line. We had seen this before, we had not seen it in chorus. Somewhere between the 7th and 8th tremors, a swarm of small quakes rattled southern Spain, the Baetic Cordillera clicking like teeth in a chill. In Morocco, lamps swung in old riads. In Lisbon, a few citizens, because history is not forgotten, stepped into squares and counted the seconds between pulses against the seconds of the past. The clocks did not match old ghosts, they matched the sky. Impossible fact, quartz wristwatches in a laboratory in Geneva, kept under stable temperature and pressure for metrology tests, simultaneously drifted by the same additional 38 microseconds during the main pulse. Different circuits, different manufacturers, one exact error. When they were reset later, they kept perfect time again. The report wrote what everyone already knew, anomalous synchronization, and filed the folder. There was no drawer for such a thing. At 1859, the eighth quake, a 7.2 in Alaska's Aleutians, deep but clean. A slab shift that rang through the crust and was heard as a murmur in Seattle's high rises 1,000 kilometers away. Traffic lights blinked in unison, though they were on separate loops. A violin in an empty conservatory practice room in Vancouver let out a single petulant note. Somewhere, a child laughed at the ghost in the strings and then grew quiet because the grown-ups did not laugh with him. Speculation arc, gently. Perhaps the impossible day was not a random crest in a storm, but the moment resonance reached the edge of runaway, the point where small pushes no longer return to rest but amplify, each nudge finding the previous one still in the air. Some believed that Atlas, with its shimmering sheath and disciplined spin, had become the perfect striker, adding tiny taps at exactly the right intervals to keep the star ringing and the planet shivering. What if this was less an accident than a test? Can your world hold its tune when the conductor accelerates? The ninth and final quake arrived at 2351 off the coast of Mexico, a 7.9 that ripped 100 leagues of seafloor and set cathedral bells jangling across Oaxaca. In a hillside town, a woman in a white dress stepped into the street, placed her hand on a stucco wall, and felt it buzz like an animal trying not to cry out. She closed her eyes and counted to 22, and when she reached the number, the buzz softened, then rose again to match it. She did not know why she knew to count. The world had taught her, gently, in a single day. Forensic comparison. The Tohoku event shortened Earth's day by 1.8 microseconds. The impossible day carved away almost an entire millisecond. Axial tilt shifted by an additional 12 centimeters, a barely audible click in the gimbal of a gyroscope as big as a planet. No one could feel the angle change. Everyone could feel what it meant. Relief line. The planet had slipped in its frame. Before midnight, data centers compiled the day into graphics that looked like cardiac monitors, Peaks marched with military neatness. The sun's X-ray flux spikes dovetailed with geomagnetic teeth, ionospheric density waves braided with sea, pressure pulses, ground accelerations stacked into towers. The old messy world was briefly orderly. And that was the most frightening thing of all. Across the gulf of space, Atlas rotated. Observatories now too battered by radiation storms to hold steady borrowed moments between flares to snatch frames that were more artifact than image. Still, some frames agreed. The plasma sheath billowed, then narrowed, then billowed again, as if flexing. The period never wavered. 4 hours, 42 minutes. 4 hours, 42 minutes. The metronome did not tire. Impossible fact. During the last global peak, antennas in Australia and South Africa heard a narrowband whisper at 1420 MHz. The hydrogen line, a 2-second thread that braided itself through the static and then was gone. The two continents were not pointed toward one another, yet both recorded the same phase, as if the signal used the Earth itself as a reflector. The log files went into separate archives with signatures and checksums and the same sick, holy silence after. People slept in shifts, others did not sleep. Dogs whined and hid under tables. Cats stared at corners as if the air there had thickened. In hospitals, EEG monitors on sedated patients printed tiny entrainments that matched the 22-minute solar oscillation. The brain, that most private instrument, was listening too. Speculation arc, second, soft. Some believed this was the crescendo before the fall, that after such a day, the system would exhaust itself and slacken. But the magnetometers did not slacken. The solar wind did not slacken. The quiet between pulses did not lengthen. If anything, the rests grew tighter, the measures packed. Relief line. We had reached the ceiling of coincidence and were still climbing. Just before the date rolled over, a final detail slipped into the ledger like a hand sliding a note under a door. A network of superconducting gravimeters, machines so sensitive they can feel the tide of the moon in bedrock, registered a brief planet-wide decrease in local gravitational acceleration, 30 parts per billion, lasting less than a minute. It was not an instrument error. 10 stations on 5 continents recorded the same dip. Gravity had eased, then returned, like a muscle unclenching under an unseen palm. Speculation arc, third and last. What if resonance, once engaged, tugs not only on magnetic fields and stones, but on spacetime's weave itself? A tiny give where the fabric has been plucked too long. No model held it, no equation welcomed it, but the data sat in rows, immaculate, uninterested in being believed. Midnight passed. The clocks, scolded and corrected by atomic standards, displayed a new day. But days meant less now. The measure that mattered lived elsewhere, in the intervals the star kept, in the rotations of a visitor born under another sun, in the rhythm the planet could not ignore. Streets were quiet. Windows reflected aurora. Somewhere, a violin string finally went slack. The impossible day did not end with a crash. It ended with a pause, thin as foil, stretched to transparency, and into that pause, as if stepping from behind a curtain. The sun drew breath. But what came next? History has always left us echoes, in dusty chronicles, in brittle scrolls, in the stories told by survivors who never had the words for what they saw. The impossible day forced scientists to turn back to those echoes, because the present was too incomprehensible to stand alone. If earthquakes and solar storms were now moving as one, perhaps they always had, only hidden beneath the blindness of old instruments and the poetry of human fear. In Mexico, scholars reopened the codices of the Maya. They found painted glyphs of fire in the sky, followed by mountains that cracked open, rivers that reversed their flow, cities swallowed in trembling earth. One record, the Chilam Balam of Chumiel, speaks of the great star that crossed the heavens and made the ground roar like jaguars. For centuries, historians treated it as metaphor, a symbolic warning of drought or war, but now, in the aftermath of Atlas's arrival, the line read like data, an interstellar visitor and a trembling earth, described with the language of gods because no other words existed. Relief line. Myth had been data all along. We had only lacked the key. In China, bamboo annals described nights when the sky bled red curtains and the ground shook as if a dragon turned beneath it. In 132 AD, Zhang Heng built the first seismoscope, a bronze urn with dragons that dropped balls when the ground moved. Records from his time mention a strange sequence, tremors to the west arriving at the same hour as auroras over the northern frontier. No one then could explain how the heavens and the earth conversed. Now, centuries later, the conversation had resumed. Impossible fact, Roman accounts of the Great Quake of 62 AD, which toppled Pompeii before Vesuvius ever erupted, describe globes of fire racing across the sky days before the tremors. Pliny the Elder dismissed them as lightning, but satellite data from April showed plasma globes, coronal mass ejections, drifting like fire across the magnetosphere days before quakes struck. Ancient eyes had seen what we had seen without knowing the scale. In the quiet halls of the Vatican Library, scholars turned to accounts of the 1755 Lisbon disaster. The quake, magnitude 8.7, had leveled one of Europe's grandest cities. Survivors spoke of the sea glowing green, of auroras visible at noon, of a sky humming like a harp hours before the wave came. These details had always been dismissed as exaggerations of frightened minds, but now they looked less like panic and more like evidence, precisely the kinds of anomalies April's instruments had recorded before the impossible day. Relief line. The past had not been silent. We had been deaf. Forensic detail. Global historical databases record an average of one great earthquake, magnitude 8 or higher, every 20 years across the last millennium. But clustering is evident, bursts of activity every few centuries, often coinciding with auroral events in chronicles. In the 9th century, multiple quakes devastated Persia, Japan, and the eastern Mediterranean within decades, while Byzantine records describe celestial torches above Constantinople. In the 14th century, when the sun entered the mysterious Wolf minimum, tremors multiplied, accompanied by reports of crimson skies. The math suggests not randomness, but recurrence. Speculation arc. Perhaps Earth's crust has always been sensitive to rhythms larger than itself. Perhaps visitors like Atlas have passed before, unseen, unrecorded except in fragments of myth, stirring both star and stone. What if civilizations long gone were erased not by plague or war, but by resonance? Worlds shaken apart when the sun was struck awake. Impossible fact, in the mid-1800s, during the Carrington event, when solar flares burned telegraph wires and set fire to paper, several large quakes rattled the Aleutians, Chile, and New Zealand within days of the storm. At the time, no connection was possible. One was dismissed as geological, the other astronomical. But when April's data was overlaid onto Carrington's records, the signature matched, a pulse linking sky and ground. Relief line. We had lived through resonance before, but we had not named it. Archaeologists pointed to legends in Peru of Viracocha, the god who emerged after the sky turned white and the mountains cracked. In Norse myth, Ragnarok begins with quakes and skies aflame. Polynesian chants speak of a star that sang to the sun until the sea rose. Across cultures, across millennia, the same sequence appeared: skyfire, ground shatter, collapse, poetry, yes, but also pattern. Forensic note: modern analysis of tree rings revealed spikes in carbon-14, evidence of massive cosmic radiation, coinciding with unexplained historical disasters. In 774 AD, such a spike aligned with reports of crimson skies and quakes across Asia. In 993 AD, another spike matched European tales of fiery dragons and collapsed villages. Radiation, auroras, earthquakes, the same chain repeating through centuries. Impossible fact: ice cores drilled in Antarctica revealed layers of nitrate consistent with solar proton events, buried alongside ash layers from simultaneous global volcanic eruptions. The link was stark. Bursts from the sun, quakes, eruptions, collapse. Earth's history had not been random chaos. It had been resonance, struck and replayed. Relief line. The archive of stone and ice told the story our ancestors tried to speak. Speculation arc. What if Atlas was only one of many? A fleet of sleepers cast adrift across the galaxy, each designed to wake stars, to test planets, to measure the resilience of life. Some believed Earth had been tested before, centuries ago. But the instruments of those times could not decode the message. This time, we were awake enough to watch it happen, helpless to stop it. In Chile, survivors of the recent quake found shards of pottery etched with spiral glyphs left by the Mapuche. Elders translated, "When the sky sings, the earth dances." The line, once myth, now sounded like instruction. Earthquakes were not random violence, they were choreography. Impossible fact. During the Impossible Day, archaeological sensors buried at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey registered microtremors precisely aligned with solar oscillations. Despite lying thousands of kilometers from any active fault, the stones, carved 12,000 years ago, shivered as if remembering. Relief line. Even monuments older than history kept the beat. Forensic comparison. April's global energy release exceeded by 20 times the yearly average. If the pace continued, by June, the total would rival the Chicxulub impact in net energy. Humanity would not survive such output without collapse of infrastructure, food, and atmosphere. The countdown was visible in numbers, not prophecies. Speculation. Arc. Perhaps the ancients did not survive their resonance. Perhaps entire civilizations fell not to drought or war, but to the rhythm we were now trapped inside. And maybe the whispers of gods, dragons, stars were the only language they had left to describe the conductor. Relief line. We had thought we were writing new history. We were only repeating old verses. Impossible fact. On April 30th, after the Impossible Day had settled into its grim legend, a team in Japan reviewed ancient seismograms recorded on smoked paper from the 1923 Kanto quake. Buried in the traces was a secondary signal, oscillations at 22 minutes, identical to those now seen in the sun's corona. A forgotten quake had already carried the rhythm of resonance a century ago, waiting for us to notice. The realization was unbearable. Resonance was not new. It was old, recurring, inevitable. Atlas had not created the song. It had only amplified it, louder, clearer, crueler. And if history was true, if resonance always ended in collapse, then the Impossible Day was not the end. It was the middle. The crescendo had not yet arrived. The sun was still building, the earth still quivering, Atlas still falling toward the furnace. Relief line. We were not at the conclusion. We were at the overture. And as April gave way to May, every eye turned upward. The auroras grew brighter, the quakes grew harder, the myths grew sharper. Humanity had unlocked the echoes of the past, only to realize they were living inside them. But what came next? The earth does not like to show its wounds. For billions of years, it has healed them with oceans, forests, lava, and sand, hiding the seams of its violence beneath layers of time. But now, the crust no longer concealed. It broke open in front of our eyes, scars fresh and raw, stretching so far and so straight that they could be seen from orbit. What had once been invisible tension lines in the planet's body were suddenly revealed as fractures, continental gashes that reminded us this world was not solid ground, but a restless shell floating on fire. On May 3rd, satellites scanning the East African Rift reported something no geologist was prepared to see: a crack 600 kilometers long that had split the desert floor overnight. It was not subtle. The earth had yawned open in a scar as wide as a 4-lane highway, walls of dust rising on either side. Villages perched along its length collapsed as the ground simply vanished beneath them. Cattle disappeared into the dark. Roads were sheared in half. The fracture was so fresh that the heat of the mantle radiated faintly from its depths, steam curling upward like the breath of the planet itself. Forensic note: the East African Rift had always been known as a zone of slow separation, plates drifting apart by a few millimeters each year. In 5 to 10 million years, scientists said, Africa would split, birthing a new ocean. But the rift was not supposed to move on human timescales. In May, it leapt forward centuries in a single night. GPS stations confirmed displacements of over 2 meters in places, millennia of motion compressed into hours. Relief line. The future did not wait. It arrived all at once. Impossible fact. On the very same day, halfway across the world, a fissure erupted in Mexico. Nearly 400 kilometers of desert floor cracked open near Sonora, parallel to the African Rift, as though the two were mirrors of one another. Local farmers awoke to find their fields divided by a canyon that had not existed the night before. The fissure swallowed irrigation canals, tore power lines, and stretched so straight it looked like the trace of some cosmic blade. Scientists called it coincidence, but the geometry was merciless. Both rifts formed along nearly the same latitude, both on the same day, both with displacements that could not be explained by local tectonics alone. Relief line, 2 wounds, 1 rhythm. In Iceland, the ground bulged upward by nearly half a meter, measured by interferometric satellites that compared radar pulses days apart. Within the bulge, cracks radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. Seismographs recorded harmonic tremors, low, droning rumbles that usually precede volcanic eruptions. But no eruption came. The Earth was vibrating, not to release pressure, but to sustain it. In laboratories, physicists recognized the waveform, the same 22-minute oscillation seen in the Sun's corona and in Atlas's plasma sheath. The Earth's crust had become an instrument resonating in sympathetic harmony, too precise to be coincidence. Impossible fact. Along the San Andreas Fault, segments of freeway shifted by 30 centimeters. Even though no quake had occurred, the slabs simply moved, steady and silent, as if pressed by unseen fingers. Engineers found no fractures, no ruptures, only a whole highway that had slid sideways overnight. The crust was no longer waiting for quakes to release energy. It was reconfiguring itself between them. Relief line. Stone was flowing like water. Forensic detail. The Chicxulub impact left a crater 180 kilometers wide, scars still visible after 65 million years. May's fractures rivaled such devastation in scale, though not in violence. In Kenya, a new canyon stretched 20 kilometers long and 15 meters deep. Cutting through farmland that had been whole the day before, in Turkey, a 50-kilometer crack traced itself across fields, roads, and streams. So clean it resembled a surveyor's line. Earthquakes had always torn and ruptured, but never with such coordinated geometry. Impossible fact. When mapped globally, the new fractures aligned into a pattern faint but unmistakable, hexagons and arcs echoing the oscillations of the sun itself. The planet was etching stellar harmonics into its skin. Relief line. We were watching the handwriting of the sky on the body of the Earth. Speculation arc. Some suggested that Atlas had become more than a conductor of resonance. It had become a sculptor, reshaping the crust according to frequencies we could not hear. Perhaps this was the true function of such interstellar objects, not merely to wake stars, but to carve their planets, testing whether they could withstand the rhythm. Others, darker, proposed that Earth was being prepared, tuned like an instrument for a performance yet to come. Meanwhile, the human toll grew unbearable. In Ethiopia, entire towns vanished into the widening rift. In Mexico, highways bent into useless zigzags. In Alaska, a line of fractures cut across oil pipelines, spilling rivers of blackened snow. Relief tents filled with families who had lost not only homes, but the ground itself. Fear was no longer abstract. It was carved into the land, visible to anyone who looked down. Forensic note, geodesy satellites measured Earth's shape deforming by fractions of kilometers. The equatorial bulge shifted. The length of day fluctuated erratically, not by microseconds, but milliseconds. The planet's balance was off, kilter, wobbling like a spinning coin about to fall. Relief line, the Earth had become a broken gyroscope. Impossible fact, on May 12th, during a lull in seismic noise, gravimeters recorded a global pulse lasting 43 minutes. It was not a quake, not weather, not magnetic. It was gravity itself, dipping and rising by 20 parts per billion, synchronized across continents. For a brief hour, the weight of the world literally lightened, then grew heavy again. Scientists stared at the printouts, their hands trembling. Gravity had always been untouchable. Now it seemed pliable, tugged by forces they could not see. Speculation arc. What if resonance sustained too long does not only shake crust and stir magma? What if it stretches space-time itself, bending the weave that holds a planet together? If so, then Atlas was not merely a traveler, it was a knife, cutting not with metal but with frequency. Relief line. The world was no longer a sphere of stone, it was an instrument stretched across the void. By mid-May, fractures scarred every continent. South America's Andes split with new valleys. The Himalayas, mountains born of collision, shifted 3 meters east in a week. Africa was tearing in half, its future ocean arriving in days rather than millions of years. Humanity stood not on land, but on a shell cracking open, its bones exposed. Impossible fact, satellites captured heat signatures glowing along fracture lines hours before they broke open. The lines pulsed faintly in infrared, lighting up like veins under a blacklight. The Earth was bleeding energy before it tore, a prelude written in fire. And all the while, Atlas moved closer. Its plasma sheath brightened, shimmering like a blade in sunlight. Every flare from its surface matched a flare from the sun. Every rotation of its body mirrored a quake, a fracture, a scar. It was not coincidence, it was orchestration. Relief line. The conductor had raised its hand and the world obeyed. Speculation arc. If this was orchestration, then what came next would be crescendo. The fractures were not the finale. They were the tuning. The Earth was being primed, adjusted, aligned. And once alignment was perfect, the performance would begin. The impossible day had shown us rhythm. May had shown us scars. And as Atlas approached perihelion, the sun's surface writhed with anticipation, flaring brighter, pulsing harder, feeding the resonance that now tore continents. The chain was nearly complete. But what came next? It approached the furnace like a moth too fearless to know fear. Three-Eye Atlas, the shard from another star, tumbled through space toward the blazing heart of the system, closer with every hour. Its velocity climbed past 70 kilometers per second, nearly twice the speed of Oumuamua. By mid-May, it would reach perihelion, its closest pass around the sun. If it survived the heat, it would slingshot back into the dark, never to return. But in its approach, it had already altered the fate of a world. On May 19th, telescopes at Lagrange Point 1 captured Atlas with stunning clarity before radiation overwhelmed the sensors. Its sheath of plasma had stretched into a tail more than 10 million kilometers long, a luminous thread brighter than predictions by orders of magnitude. It was no ordinary comet coma. The glow rippled like a sail catching wind, bending not randomly but with disciplined rhythm, the same 4.7-hour pulse that had shaken the Earth and stirred the sun. Forensic note: solar radiation pressure at that distance should have shredded a body of Atlas's size, but the object held its form, its surface dark except for periodic flares. Spectrographic readings detected iron, nickel, and traces of exotic isotopes unknown in the solar system, materials dense enough to survive a plunge most rocks would vaporize in. The numbers whispered a truth too disturbing to say aloud. Atlas was not fragile. It was resilient. Relief line. It was not prey to the sun. It was entering it as if invited. Impossible fact. As Atlas neared perihelion, solar oscillations spiked. The entire star seemed to thrum with pulses in lockstep with its visitor. Magnetograms traced waves rippling from pole to pole, precise to the second. The sun had found a beat, a tempo borrowed from an interstellar stranger. To those who had studied stars their whole lives, it looked less like physics and more like possession. On May 20th, the sun erupted with an event so violent that even seasoned astronomers could not name it. A storm of plasma blasted outward at nearly 4,000 kilometers per second, faster than any CME in recorded history. Instruments estimated the kinetic energy at 2 secs, 10^26 joules, equivalent to the detonation of every nuclear warhead on Earth, multiplied 1 billion times. The storm dwarfed the Carrington event, dwarfed even the flares that had blinded sensors weeks before. The sun had awoken into rage. Relief line. It was no longer a cycle, it was a convulsion. At the same hour, the Earth quaked in unison. From Tokyo to Los Angeles, from Delhi to Cape Town, seismographs lit up. In less than 12 hours, 17 major quakes erupted, the strongest, a 9.1 off the coast of Alaska. Tsunami waves crashed across the Pacific Rim, flooding ports, swallowing villages. Entire stretches of coastline sank by meters as tectonic slabs shifted. The combined energy release of those quakes reached 1020 joules. Humanity had never recorded so much power unleashed in so little time. Impossible fact, the tremors did not radiate outward from their epicenters in the usual concentric waves. Instead, stations worldwide recorded the same phase arriving simultaneously, a global resonance with no point of origin. The Earth shook as a whole, like a drum struck dead center by a hand larger than the planet itself. Speculation arc. What if Atlas was not just stirring resonance, but amplifying it? What if the sun's fury was being fed downward into the Earth through magnetic cords, with Atlas acting as the bridge, the catalyst, the conductor of a cosmic circuit? The planet had become the endpoint of an interstellar experiment, the ground beneath our feet a resistor in a current too vast to comprehend. Relief line. The Earth was no longer an island, it was a node in a circuit. Forensic detail. The planet's axis tilted an additional 20 centimeters in one day. The length of day shortened by 2 milliseconds. Gravity fluctuated by 40 parts per billion. Oceans sloshed against their basins, tides growing chaotic, storms born in minutes that tore across continents. Civilization, tuned to a fragile equilibrium, staggered under changes invisible to the eye but merciless to the infrastructure of power, transport, food. Impossible fact. In the deserts of Nevada, underground nuclear test vaults sealed since the 1960s reopened as the ground flexed. In Siberia, methane craters detonated spontaneously, sending plumes of flame hundreds of meters high. In the Amazon, rivers reversed flow for hours, pulled by oscillations in Earth's crust. Entire systems broke their rules, moving in ways they were not built to move. In laboratories, instruments grew uncanny. Magnetometers pulsed not only with solar storms, but with a secondary signature, 3 peaks, always 3, repeating at 4-pi-hour intervals. Spectrographs aimed at Atlas revealed the same pattern, encoded in light. Some argued it was a natural consequence of rotation. Others admitted what their minds dreaded. The repetition looked like intent. A message sent in triplet beats, woven into the skin of Earth's field. Relief line. It was not only resonance, it was language. Speculation arc. Perhaps Atlas was one of many such objects, seeded across interstellar space, each carrying the same rhythm, each awakening stars in turn. Perhaps the universe itself was an instrument, tuned by travelers older than our species, older than our world. If so, then Earth's resonance was not the accident of geology. It was participation. Meanwhile, human cities cracked. San Francisco's Bay Bridge sagged into the water. Santiago's skyline folded as towers leaned against each other like drunks. In Jakarta, entire districts vanished beneath the sea. Across the Himalayas, villages disappeared under avalanches as slopes shook loose. Relief shelters overflowed. Communications collapsed. Leaders spoke of resilience even as their capitals crumbled. Forensic note, global energy released by earthquakes in May equaled 3x 10^20 joules. That is 1/3 the energy of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. The difference was in duration. Chicxulub struck in a second. May's convulsions were stretched into days, weeks, slow violence, giving the illusion of survival while tearing civilization apart one fracture at a time. Relief line. Extinction need not arrive in a flash. It can come as a rhythm. Impossible fact. In the skies above Africa, auroras spiraled downward so low they touched mountaintops, crackling across rock like lightning that refused to strike. Shepherds reported sheep collapsing as the air itself hummed. In Norway, northern lights bent into perfect hexagons, shapes no natural aurora had ever taken. Cameras captured them glowing in crystalline symmetry, as though Earth's magnetosphere had been drafted into geometry by an unseen hand. The sun, meanwhile, did not relent. Every flare matched Atlas's spin. Every pulse echoed into Earth. The chain was unbroken, unstoppable, merciless. Astronomers spoke in hushed tones. Atlas had reached perihelion. Its plasma sheath wrapped the sun like a leash. For a brief moment, the visitor and the star were one. Speculation arc. What if this was the purpose? To bind a star, to harness its fury, to make planets below sing in rhythm until they broke. If so, then Earth's fractures were not incidental. They were the intended result of a machine whose age spanned stars. Relief line. The visitor had awakened the host, and the host was feeding the song. On May 21st, the unthinkable occurred. The Earth shuddered with such force that every seismograph saturated. Magnitudes lost meaning. The scales were designed for quakes, not for global events. For 20 minutes, the entire crust slipped. Continents lurching centimeters to meters in synchronized motion. Oceans sloshed across coasts. Mountains groaned. Cities fell. People staggered under skies lit blood, red by auroras. Impossible fact. During the global quake, superconducting gravimeters detected space-time itself vibrating, a ripple faint but measurable, stretching across the planet. Earth had become a gravitational wave source, broadcasting its agony into the cosmos. Relief line. The song was no longer confined to Earth, it had been sent into the dark. And as the tremors eased, Atlas flared brighter than ever before. Observers caught their final image before instruments fried, the object's sheath expanding, flexing like a lung exhaling flame. At the same moment, the sun's corona rippled outward, luminous waves circling the disk. Together, they shone like conductor and orchestra, star and shard bound in a duet. Humanity, broken and bleeding, could only watch. But what came next? When the tremors finally ebbed, it was not silence that followed, but a strange and aching stillness, as though the planet had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Skies over every continent glowed with curtains of aurora, rippling in violet and green, shimmering even at noon. Oceans sloshed against their coasts with a rhythm more like a heartbeat than a tide. The world had not ended. Not yet, but it had been remade. In the weeks since Atlas reached perihelion, Earth had been tested in ways no history had ever recorded. Continents had shifted centimeters, even meters. Faults once dormant had awakened. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced. Billions stood under skies that no longer belonged to the old familiar world. The Earth had sung in resonance with the sun, conducted by a visitor from another star. And now, the echoes hung in the air, refusing to fade. Forensic detail. Seismographs still hummed with microtremors long after the great quakes subsided. Oscillations of 22 minutes pulsed through the crust, faint but persistent, as though the Earth had learned a rhythm it could not forget. The magnetosphere still bore scars, dented by solar storms that arrived in disciplined bursts. Even as the sun quieted, its cycles were altered. The normal 11-year heartbeat replaced by irregular pulses mapped neatly onto Atlas's spin. The visitor was already leaving, slingshotting back toward the dark between stars, yet its fingerprint remained etched into star and stone alike. Relief line. The conductor had left the stage, but the music lingered. Impossible fact. In May's aftermath, global positioning systems revealed subtle but permanent changes. The Pacific Plate now moved 10 millimeters faster each year than before. Africa's Rift Valley widened by half a meter. The Himalayas, mountains already restless, surged upward by 4 centimeters. In geological terms, these were violent leaps, ages compressed into months. Humanity had lived through time folded, epochs condensed into seasons, and still, the whispers of resonance persisted. Magnetometers in Japan recorded 3 repeating peaks every 4.7 hours, an echo of Atlas's rotation that should no longer exist now that the object had passed perihelion. No explanation sufficed. Some claimed the signal was stored in Earth's core, reverberating like a struck gong. Others feared it was being sustained deliberately, that Atlas had imprinted a rhythm into our world, one that would never fade. Relief line. Even after the visitor was gone, its song played on. Speculation arc. Perhaps Earth was not alone. Perhaps every star with planets had its own Atlas, a shard drifting in on hidden trajectories, stirring resonance, etching scars, teaching its rhythm to new worlds. What if the galaxy was full of such tests, silent until they revealed themselves in fire and quake? Humanity, for the first time, had proof it was not separate, not unique. It was part of a greater experiment, cosmic, deliberate, inscrutable. Impossible fact, in the final days of May, antennas in Australia and Chile recorded a faint signal at 1420 MHz, the hydrogen line. Unlike before, it was longer, 42 seconds, steady, repeating once, then vanishing. When translated into binary, it yielded nothing but static. Yet some argued the structure was too ordered to dismiss. Others wondered if it was not a message for us, but a handshake between Atlas and the Sun, a confirmation that the circuit had been completed. In villages shattered by quakes, people spoke of omens. In Ethiopia, survivors called the new rift the scar of the sky. In Mexico, elders compared the desert fissure to the ancient myths of gods carving the earth. In Iceland, children drew auroras shaped like hexagons and asked their parents why the sky now made patterns. Humanity was trying to narrate what it had seen, and like all before, it resorted to poetry. Science could measure the tremors, the fields, the signals. But the meaning, if meaning existed, belonged to imagination. Relief line. We had survived the performance, but we had not understood the song. Forensic comparison. Total energy released by quakes in April and May equaled roughly 4 exa 20 joules, 10% of the Chicxulub impact, enough to alter Earth's rotation, tilt, and length of day, enough to change climates for decades. Satellites now predicted shifts in jet streams, ocean currents, rainfall. Resonance had not ended with quakes. It had rewritten the canvas on which weather painted life. Speculation arc. Some believed this was the true function of resonance, not destruction, but transformation. To stir planets into new forms, to break their crusts, tilt their axes, force their systems to evolve. Civilizations caught in the process would collapse, but the planets themselves would be reforged, perhaps for futures not our own. Impossible fact. Tree rings forming in the spring of 2025 already showed elevated carbon-14, proof of cosmic radiation striking Earth at levels unseen in centuries. Future scientists would find those rings and know something extraordinary had happened. Even if words and memories failed, the planet itself was writing history in wood, in stone, in ice. Relief line. The archive of Earth was already recording the resonance. In June, Atlas was gone. Its trajectory carried it back into the interstellar gulf, its plasma sheath dimming, its light swallowed by distance, but the scars remained. The sun pulsed irregularly. The earth trembled faintly in rhythm. Humanity, broken and diminished, stood under a sky it no longer trusted. Survival was possible, but certainty was gone. Forensic note, telescopes tracked Atlas for as long as they could, measuring its fading light. The object rotated steadily, its 4.7-hour period unbroken. Even as it vanished, it kept time. The universe's metronome moved on to other stars, other worlds. We were only one verse in its endless score. Relief line. We had been played, now the music moved elsewhere. Speculation arc. Perhaps this was not the end, but the beginning. If Atlas was one of many, then others would come. If resonance was universal, then every world lived under the same threat, the same test. And if so, then humanity's survival was less a triumph than a reprieve, a pause before the next conductor lifted its hand. Impossible fact, in the days after Atlas's departure, deep space antennas detected a faint global hum, not local, not solar, but cosmic, arriving from all directions at once, its frequency, the same 22-minute oscillation etched into quakes and auroras. It seemed to bleed from the universe itself, as if resonance was not confined to one star, one visitor, one world. It was everywhere, waiting, woven into space-time like a secret baseline. Relief line. The resonance had not left, it had only revealed its scale. And so the story ends not with collapse, but with unease. The earth still turns, the sun still burns, Humanity still walks on fractured ground, but beneath each step lies the memory of rhythm, the knowledge that stone can dance to a song older than stars. We were not destroyed. We were reminded, we were told, in quakes and fire and auroras, that the universe is not silent. The myths of old had not lied. They had only spoken in tongues too poetic for science to hear. Now we have the instruments, and the poetry remains. Together, they tell the same truth. The sky sings, the ground answers, and we are caught between. Relief line. Perhaps survival is not victory. Perhaps it is only listening long enough to understand. The earth lies scarred. The sun lies restless. The interstellar shard vanishes into dark. And yet, the legacy of its visit lingers in every fracture, every pulse, every aurora that glows too far south. Humanity is smaller than it believed, and the cosmos larger, stranger, more deliberate. Perhaps we will rebuild. Perhaps we will forget. Perhaps one day, another atlas will arrive, and another world will learn the rhythm. We can only stand under the stars and wonder. Perhaps the universe has only begun to whisper.